Hello, I am Ignacio Sanchez Prado. I'm a professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. I am the host and moderator of this event. For those of you who require it, we have a live audio translation from English to Spanish for this program. Please click on the Zoom link in the description below or in the chat to access this service. This year's Lit and Loose Festival features both in-person events and virtual events, such as this one. We're grateful to be back in person and also to be able to connect online with audiences through the US, Mexico, and beyond. Now in its eighth cycle, Make Literary Productions Lit and Loose, Festival of Language, Literature and Art, supports the creation of new art through international collaboration and makes space for essential dialogues between residents of Mexico and the United States. This year's festival theme, Structure, considers the physical structures that houses political, societal structures around us. There are still two more days of the festival, including an in-person event I host tonight with Mexican authors Pergentino José and Yasmina Barrera, the Instituto Cervantes here in Chicago, as well as a free writing workshop tomorrow with Pergentino. We have the pleasure of having three guests in this panel. The first one is Amrita Das. She's an associate professor of Spanish at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she teaches Spanish language and Latinx literature courses. Her recent research focuses on contemporary U.S. literature in Spanish. She's the co-editor of the critical volume Contemporary U.S. Latinx Literature in Spanish, Straddling Identities, and the literary anthologies Ecos Urbanos, Literatura Contemporánea en Español en Estados Unidos in the Hostos Review, and Teatro Latino, Nuevas Obras de los Estados Unidos. Our second guest is Naida Saavedra. She's a writer, scholar, and professor. She's the author of Voz que no viste, que no lloré por vos, Habitat, Última Inocencia, En esta tierra maldita, and Bestiario y otras miserias. Her most recent book of short stories, Desordenadas, was published in 2019 by SED, or Suburbano. Her research focuses on issues of identity, migration, and social media in contemporary Latinx literature. She's a co-editor with Amrita in some of the anthologies that I mentioned before, and she's currently documented the literary movement in Spanish in the US, for which she published the book #New Latino Boom, Cartografía de la Narrativa en Español de Estados Unidos, with el BieSMan Press in 2020. And BieSMan is one of our hosts. Saavedra lives in Massachusetts, where she's a professor of Latinx and Latin American literature at Worcester State University. It's Worcester, right? Like Worcestershire sauce, Worcester State University. And Santiago Vaquera Vásquez is an unrepentant border crosser, ex-DJ, Chicano writer, painter, and academic, an associate professor of creative writing and Hispanic Southwest literatures and cultures at the University of New Mexico. He has also taught and studies in universities across the United States, Latin America, and Europe. He has held Fulbright fellowships in Spain, Turkey, and Poland. His books include Algún día te cuento las cosas que he visto, luego El silencio, One Day I'll Tell You the Things I've Seen, and En el Lost y Found. His more recent works are a photographic chapbook of photos and stories from travels in Turkey, Yavansi Extranjero, and the novel Nocturno de Frontera. Widely published in Spanish, his work has appeared in anthologies and literary journals in Spain, Italy, Latin America, and the US. He has discussed his work with Eduardo Alfón and Daniel Alarcón in The Believer, and with El Mundo Paz Soldán and Santiago Roncagliolo in the Arizona Journal of Hispanic Cultural Studies. Commenting on his writing, Junot Diaz has said, Santiago Vaquera is literary lightning. He impresses, he illuminates, and when he's at his best, you're left shaken and in awe. So I can attest to that because I've known Santiago for a while, and this is absolutely true. So to begin our conversation, I would like to ask Amrita, who's a fellow scholar, to speak a little bit about her concept of the new Latino boom. How does it refer to Latinx literature in general? Or is there a specific subset of writers that belong to this new movement? And then we will have a conversation with Naida and Santiago, who are both scholars and writers in this movement. So Amrita, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ignacio, and thank you to Lit and Loose Festival for organizing this panel. That's a very loaded question, and I hope the others will join in and help me out. To begin with, yes, I would say yes, there is a boom happening in this century, in the 21st century. Of course, we've got to remember that Spanish literary production has happened since the Spaniards came to the Americas and in what we call United States today, the territories. And what we would consider contemporary literature within Latino Latinx studies is usually kind of defined beyond 1960s. And beyond 1960s, we see, especially the Chicano authors who are much more organized, during the movement, they are writing in Spanish. Then, of course, the Cuban exiles who come, they are writing the Puerto Rican. So there is a lot of Spanish production happening in the contemporary times, but the boom that we are seeing now in the 21st century is in a lot of ways, of course, Naida has kind of talked a lot about it in her book, has to do with these small independent publishers. And as Naida points out in her book, there's in Miami, in Chicago, in New York. And they are using technology in a way that was not available before to us. And to really understand the new Latino boom, you have to be on social media. I just follow Facebook. I've been following authors, I've been following publishers, and it is overwhelming the number of books that are coming out every day. And I never finish one book. I pick up another book and I'm trying to follow. I'm still reading Santiago's latest novel, and it's a tough novel to read. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that yes, there's a boom happening right now, and it is because there are these different actors. And this is a very organic movement, I would say, in a way. Or some people kind of object to the term movement because it's not that people got together and decided this is what we're going to do. It was just kind of a need that a lot of writers felt who were writing in Spanish in the United States, that they did not have an avenue to publish. And so many of them started creating these independent presses. And they're using this print on demand, the POD model, where you just print when somebody buys a book. And so even though it happened organically, now the conversation has started. People know each other, they're connecting. And so it is kind of becoming a little more structured. And so I certainly feel that there is a boom, and there's an interest that is happening both as far as readership outside the academia and also the academia. So I'll stop here because I know there was a lot of more to that question, but I think we can come back and talk about those.
Yeah, and Naida, since you have collaborated with Amrita, I would like to hear your side of this question too.
Yeah, I want to just add to what Amrita mentioned. This organic movement also results in it started like a sort of collaboration, and now, as Amrita said, it's more structured. So I started to see writers who were publishing their books also writing prologues or writing blurbs of other writers publishing their other books, and then presenting their work, being the moderators of panels, going to bookstores and book fairs, and everybody was, I think, working toward the same objective, which is to promote the work, the work published in Spanish in the US. So everybody was like putting un granito de arena to working towards the same goal. I noticed that, and then I started to, I was I still am like Amrita, following Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all those. Doing a screenshot, downloaded flyers, and trying to keep a log, a record of all these events and who were participating in which and what month and what fair. And that's how I came with like kind of a database. I tried to make a map to connect the cities and to connect those actors that were working together in a way, but in a way at the same time in different cities. So that's how I came up with this study, and I have met all these wonderful people, and yeah, so that's how it came out.
It is writing in Spanish in the US has become a very complicated cartography, I think. There's a group to which I belong, of those of us who who had a career back in a Latin American country, migrated usually to the academy. And, now we have very major writers, Pedro Ángel Palou, Cristina Rivera Garza, Yuri Herrera, right? Who are located in Edmundo Pasoldan, Liliana Colanzi, who are located in U.S. universities, but essentially continue to write and publish in Latin America or in Spain. And there is also, and I'm going to turn to Santiago for this, a generation of or two of Latinx writers who wrote in Spanish and English, in some cases framed specifically by things like the New Yorican or the Chicano movements, right? And now we have what appears to be part of the case of this new Latino boom, first and second generation migrants who are Hispanophone and are publishing, but now in the context of the United States, right? So it's a map that is evolving and becoming more complex in recent years because of the diversification of diasporas and so on. But Santiago, I know you have a little bit of a historical perspective on this, on writing in Spanish. And of course, I also know from your work that Spanish is also raises here the question of Spanglish. I was wondering if you could address your perspective on this Spanish writing in the U.S.
Thanks, Nacho, and thanks, Amrita, and thanks, Naida. I'm very happy to be here with you all, and thanks also to the festival for bringing me back. I really enjoy Lit and Loose, and I think it's one of the finest festivals dedicated to literary culture in the U.S., especially with its focus on its inclusion of the Latino and the Hispanic American. So getting to your question specifically, Nacho, it is a really interesting question as we were talking about earlier in our chat, right? I mean, I love the term New Latino Boom, and I congratulate Naida for coming up with it, especially the hashtag, right? Because as Amrita pointed out, right? I mean, it is really important to remember that this is a term or a movement that comes out of social media, right? I mean, I think that this is one of the key factors. When I started publishing in Spanish in the late '90s with the anthology Líneas Aéreas in Spain, the question that I always got was, well, you're a Chicano, you were born and raised in the United States. Why are you writing in Spanish? And and it was a question that was kind of tough to answer at the time because there were so very few of us. I said that the reality is that Spanish has been a part of the United States since before the United States was united or states, right? And so we have a long tradition of writing in Spanish from the Mexican diaspora, from the Puerto Rican diaspora, the Dominican diaspora, right? I mean, all of these communities that have been that started writing and started creating, right? We're often creating for readers who were reading in Spanish, right? I mean, I think this is one of the most important things that we should think about in terms of the evolution of writing in Spanish now, right? Is when I first started, going back to the late '90s, it was a time period in which a number of the major publishing houses from Spain were putting a lot of investment into the U.S. market because they saw that Spanish was such a large mercado, right? It was the sort of like it was untapped, and so Alfaguara came in with a project. I think they wanted to publish like 4 or 5 novels a year, and this was this belief that somehow they were going to sort of come in and just make a lot of money. And the reality is it didn't work out that way. And right, we can ask ourselves why. For me, a lot of it came down to readership, right? Where are the readers? We didn't have a readership that was looking at reading, say, a literature by U.S. Latinos, which is what Alfaguara was trying to create a U.S. Latino market. And it was more interested in reading self-help books, cookbooks, right? I mean, you'd go to the bookstores. I remember going to the bookstores in about 2001, 2002 to look at what was available in Spanish. And aside from major Latin American writers who had been brought over to publish in the U.S. through Alfaguara, right? You had again a lot of self-help books. You had a lot of cookbooks. You had books by the Pope, right, in Spanish. So there was no readership, right? And this was important. And I was often asked back then, right, what are some possibilities? And I started responding that I think that the way to start doing this, to create this community was to build readership. And how do we do that? Well, one was going through one was clearly looking at what was being done in the universities with creative writing in Spanish. When I first started out as an academic and I was publishing, I used to be told I was an adjunct professor at a university in a mid-Atlantic state that shall go unnamed, and I was told by a department chair. at the time, if you ever want a job in a tenure track, never tell anybody you're a writer, because I was teaching the Spanish department. I was writing creatively, and oddly enough, or ironically enough, when I went back onto the tenure track, it was at the University of Iowa, where they hired me specifically because I was a creative writer in Spanish, and we started working. As soon as I arrived, we started working on developing its creative writing components. So there's creative writing classes in Spanish, with the idea of building an MFA in Spanish. And we ended up becoming the third. We thought we would be the second. The first is, of course, the University of Texas El Paso. The second was at NYU, and then the third was at the University of Iowa, with under the directorship of Juana Merino. And then I left soon after to come to the University of New Mexico. But I still believe it's important that it's the work that we do in the universities that helps build readership. And then the other part of this is also outlets, right? Where to get published. And what's really great, what I've seen in the last, say, 20 years, is the expansion of publication venues, right? Especially with revistas like El BieSMan out of Chicago, Contracorriente, which has been around for many years. But Literal in Houston, but also presses like Suburbano has been really fantastic, and I prefer to work with small publishing houses, and I like Suburbano a lot because they give you a lot of attention and care, and they're really invested in developing this market. But of course you've got Sudakia, and so there's a lot of really great possibilities. So sort of to run back to this question of sort of, is there a boom? Is there a new Latino boom? There is, right? There is a new Latino boom that, but it's an interesting one from when I first started, right? It's one that where we start to see a lot more Latin American writers living in the United States who are publishing in Spanish, not just in their home countries, but also in the U.S. And so I think of people also, like as Nacho has mentioned, writers who've been here for many years, like Edmundo. But there's also the writers who were here before us, like Oscar Hahn, the poet, who was at Iowa, Eduardo Espina, who's a writer who's at Texas A&M, and then the younger writers like Jennifer Thorndike, for example, and who's also in the Midwest. And I don't know if you all remember, a couple of years ago, actually no, more than a couple of years ago, there was an anthology called Casa de Locos, right? About it was just focused on creative writers in Spanish studying, doing graduate work in the United States, and so I was asked to write the introduction to that anthology. So it was really great to see, right, this body of work of writers who are up and coming, and so going back to what I was told 20 years ago from my former chair, if you ever want a job in the academy, never tell them you're a creative writer. I'm glad to say that I proved that person wrong.
So my apologies. I had an internet disconnect. So
okay.
So now I'm back. I hope my question is not out of place, but I wanted to talk to ask Amrita from her research in this matter. What do you think is the role, and this bridges upon the last comments by Santiago, of the national origin of the writers, right? Because one of the problems that we have is whenever we put these categories of the Latino something, but we're flattening, right? Like whenever they speak of the Latino vote and we don't really have a unified electoral perspective, or we talk about, the Latino something and the difference between Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans gets annulled. So I was wondering if you could address a little bit how do we scale this general idea of Latino or Latinx literature with sort of the heterogeneity of the constituent writers in these movements. Oh, Amrita, you don't have sound.
I was trying to be following the etiquette. I think identity, of course, is a very personal choice, and so every writer has a choice as to how they want to identify. Of course, when it comes to the academia, that's when we start creating these little territories, and so, of course, the term, for example, the new Latino, Debra Castillo is the first one who actually uses it. And she has an article on the Nuevo Latino y Globalización in later her book, The Redreaming America, where she kind of expands on this. And so, of course, she's talking about a new generation of Latin American authors who were not even published, were Latin Americans who are coming here and starting to write in the United States. They are first generation, of course, so therefore they are formed.
I think we've lost Amrita. The Naida, I don't know if you want to leap in, but just to sort of follow off rapidly on Amrita, right? She's correct, right, in saying that one of these issues with the university in creating these territories, and sort of how do these terms come about, are important for definition. As to your question, Nacho, about the this flattening idea, of sort of like the Latino experience into sort of both Latin American and Latinx, it's an interesting conversation, because this conversation has been it's a debate that's been had for years. I mean, when Se Habla Español, which was published by Alfaguara back in 2000, came out, one of the debates was a number of Latino scholars, a couple of Latino scholars came out forcefully against this idea of collapsing the Latin American with the U.S. Latino, because it starts to forget about, right, these communities that are much more rooted in the history of the United States, right? There's a country, and I always believe that it's important to actually sort of think of this community as together. We are, as I always say, with the Mexican American experience, that we are Mexicanos, and we are Mexicanos who express Mexico in a different way, right? And often, sometimes in a different language. And I don't know if Naida sort of has anything that you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, I would like to add a few things as a writer also, right? I'm one of those nuevas Latinas, as Debra Castillo mentioned in the article that Amrita was talking about. So then I started to publish after I moved to the United States. So I was never, let's say, considered a Venezuelan writer, right? So I didn't belong to the Venezuelan literature world, and I was not really part of the Latinx literature in the US, because I wrote in Spanish in the first place, and I was not establishing a dialogue maybe with the experience of the immigration experience and so forth, and I found myself alone, right? Until I discovered all these writers in this century that actually were writing in Spanish. It was like a home, right?
Claro.
And it goes beyond nationality. It's just the necessity of finding those outlets that Santiago you were mentioning before. So I'm here. Where do I publish? And then Suburbano is here, El BieSMan is here, Sudakia is here, and all these independent publishing houses that actually están apostando. They are really working exclusively in Spanish. Even though it's so difficult, and there's the challenge of distribution, of getting to the readership. I mean, finding the books in the bookstores. Where are the books? I mean, there are so many challenges, but still they are working on this. And then we don't have to exclusively depend on publishing houses in Mexico or Spain or Argentina to be able to publish, right? So that's a huge thing that I see. That it's hard to use one term to categorize this movement and to categorize everybody else. And maybe the Latino will, as Ignacio said, will flat the concept of it, but at the same time, it also encompasses all these characteristics that we see in the movement.
Yes. No, this is that. Thank you, Naida. And I see that Amrita is back. But I do want to say rapidly, just to sort of follow up on this question, right? El Campo now is very different from many years ago. I keep hearing an echo. I don't know if somebody has their that's a weird feedback. So okay. So so El Campo is very different, and that's one of the beauties of what's been going on now, and it and riffing off of what was said earlier about sort of the social aspect of this community. It rises from below, because it is true regarding sort of like the nationality issue. Years ago, right, I read an article where a writer was talking about the realities for being, or not the realities, but some of the issues that face writing in Spanish in the U.S. is that Latin American writers always had the opportunity to publish in their home countries, right? And so if you were Mexicano and living in the U.S., you could publish in Mexico. If you were from Spain living in the U.S., and you could publish in Spain, right? And this is a reality that still exists for many of the younger Latin American writers. They can always publish back in their home countries, but this always left sort of people like myself out of this, because I would be expected to be published in the U.S. Right? It was the same thing with Naida, saying, as Naida's, I think as you pointed out beautifully, right? I mean, you started publishing after you left Venezuela, so you're not really sort of like, where do you fit? Eres Venezolana? Are you? Where are you in this weird mapa? And I think that those of us who found ourselves in this in the U.S. wanting to publish in Spanish, right? Sometimes our options were limited, right? So for example, I published a few short stories, throughout the Americas, but I don't really have a book out in, say, Mexico. And because I'm sort of still expected as an American-born Mexican, right? That I should be publishing in the U.S. And this is the other question, or the other issue that I've just started thinking about, especially when Naida was making her comments, is I remember an essay by Daniel Alarcón years ago when he first started publishing, and he said, "What kind of a Latino am I?" Right, and where the Latino community was sort of based off of this idea of, you're Chicano, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, right? And here we have a Peruvian writer who's now starting to publish, and so I started thinking, well, what kind of a new Latino boom am I? Since if we're looking at this concept of Latin American writing from the United States, but at the same time, right, we all go through the same similar issues, right? Is just to repeat what Naida just said, right, about how you start publishing when in your new country, and this is where you expect to publish, right? So, what kind of new Latino booms are we?
I'm gonna ask Amrita to finish her sentence. She was cut off by one of these. We had already 2 outages in this presentation. It's the brave Zoom world creates those problems. So go ahead.
And sorry about that, and I hope I'm not going to repeat what Naida and Santiago already said. But what I was basically saying, when Deborah Castillo starts talking about the Nuevo Latino and the first generation immigrant who's writing in the United States, and of course, a lot of them, as we've already pointed out, were associated with the academia. Many came as graduate students, as Francisco Laguna Correa's Casa de Locos kind of captures that. And then they were writing either about Latin America from the United States, or they were writing about their urban experience here in the United States. But she also brings up this idea that now we've got to start looking at Latin American literature differently, and we've got to start looking at Latino literature differently now, using these 2 terms to kind of separate the 2 spaces. And so Latin American literature needs to include these US-based authors, and Latino literature, Latinx literature needs to include these authors who are writing in Spanish. And of course, traditionally, when we talk about Latino literature in the United States, at least in the contemporary times, the focus has been on texts that are written in English. And a lot of Santiago's contemporaries write in English, and so that, and English departments or Chicano studies department, they kind of focus on English texts. But I think there's a shift that is happening. A couple of critics, for example, Ralph Rodriguez, Christopher Gonzalez, Paul Alliston, they're all talking about there is this need. So we need to start looking differently as to what we mean by the canon, or what is Latinidad. And of course, for many of them, when they find a text in Spanish that has been translated into English, it comes into their purview and they start talking about it. But scholars like Naida, Santiago, and myself, who are in Spanish departments, and we've been trained in the Hispanic literary traditions, we have this edge in a way that we understand where these authors are coming from, their histories. And then, of course, because we also study in the United States, we can kind of understand them better. And I think it falls upon us to be doing a lot more to kind of bring them into the purview. And, that kind of goes back to the question we were talking about, readership, to creating readers. So we need to create readers in our classroom, and hopefully they will continue to read. And of course, a lot of these festivals that are happening, in Chicago, the Pilsen Fest, and Miami's Feria de Libros, they're also bringing to the audience this new authorship that that what they were not, other than just the Spanish cookbooks and books about health and well-being. So there's this, of course, there's a lot that needs to be done. Yeah. But it has to shift. We have to kind of change the way we understand Latin American literature, and also how we understand Latinx literature in the United States.
And I would say from that it might be interesting to reflect how writing in Spanish in the context of the US can in fact be a hindrance for finding some readerships, precisely because even though it's the second language of the country, the distribution of books does not favor that. If you go to any mainstream bookstore and you go to the Spanish-speaking section, you are more likely to find translations into Spanish of Anglophone works than American and Latino writers writing in Spanish in the US. The books don't distribute like Suburbanos, so like you're not going to find them in a Barnes and Noble or something like that. And at the same time, we know in recent examples that switching into English has favored some writers. The famous case right now is Valeria Luiselli, right? Who got a fame that eclipsed any recognition she had in Mexico. The minute she published a novel in English, it gives you access to the National Awards circuit. It gives you access to the International Man Booker. We saw this with Cristina Rivera Garza. The minute she translated into English, it all of the students a MacArthur fellow, right? So there is I was wondering, Naida, Santiago, there is a level of struggle to publish in Spanish, right? It is, I would believe that it's tempting to write in English, get an agent, right? Start shopping your manuscripts with Penguin, right? And there's a little bit of a demand right now of writers of color because of the movements that have called the whiteness of publishing. So I wonder, would you do that leap? Do you have any position about it? So Naida, let me let you go first, and then we'll go with Santiago.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ignacio. It's something that I've been thinking about lately and seeing a few things. For example, Katakana Editores, which is a publishing house in Miami, started a line for translation of works written in Spanish in the U.S. The last one is The Animal Days by Kayla Valdelaville, translated by Robin Myers. So I see more interest, more, it's like it's started, it has started, but it's difficult because it's another world, it's another way of distribution, another audience. And, but I think the need is there. And I think, I don't know if I would jump into that soon, but I think the need is there. I see more interest in academia and outside of academia, say, oh, so then, all these books that you talk about all the time. So I talk about this all the time. So are there English translation? And I always say they are coming up. and that was one of the reasons why when I created the hashtag in Twitter, which was like the the outlet to do it, I did it thinking about the possibility of talking about this in English, of translating this into English. So using New Latino Boom, would work in Spanish and would work in English, and then we can talk about the same thing. And there are efforts. There is Lauren Cockin, for example, with her magazine of reading. It's called Leyendo Latam. So reading Latin American works, but in English, and trying to find the attention of it. So it's there. There's the need, and I think more works are coming up, but it's difficult at the same time. I don't know, Santiago, are you planning on a translation?
Well, that's I'm gonna call Nacho out here for something that he said years ago, because I do have a book in English, right? I published one day I'll tell you the things I've seen, which oddly enough, right? I mean, when Nacho was listing my sort of biography, mentions that the first book is a chapbook called Algún día te cuento las cosas que he visto. They are not the same book, which is unfortunately is one of these problems that I've run into when I've done events where people will be like, "Well, I got your book in Spanish." I'm like, "Well, it's not really the same one," and there's a long story for that with my press at the time when they chose the title. But after I published One Day I'll Tell You the Things I've Seen, one of Nacho's first comments at a conference was, "Now we'll never see him published in Spanish again." And then of course the next year I published and I Lost and Found. So it is you're absolutely correct, Nacho. It is very difficult to continue to publish in Spanish in the United States, despite everything I've said about how el campo ha cambiado, and it is definitely easier now than it was, say, 20 years ago, but it's still not perfect, right? I mean, there's issues of distribution. I have the chat open. I guess it's the chat for that's coming up on YouTube, and the question is like, is Suburbano distributing in Latin America, right? And they're not, right? And so distribution is an issue. It's not just that they're not distributing at, say, Barnes and Noble, which is a very, very hard market to get into. And as I found out when I published my book in English, I was told, you have all these other bookstores, but this one, no. because they're very, very picky. So it is difficult, and writing in English is an option, or translating in the English. I self-translate my own work, so that's also sort of been part of the tricky things. I'm currently working on a book in English, a new book of short stories in English, but at the same time, I also have like another colección of cuentitos that are here and there that are in Spanish. But I know that again, it is difficult, and we need to continue to work on the presses to support them so that they can continue their work in getting the work out, but also in supporting them in ways that hopefully they can get into, say, Barnes and Noble, or they can get into your local bookstore. So this is why it's so very important to have that readership, and it's so very important to continue doing this, right? I mean, I continue to write in Spanish, and I often say it's because in one way it's as I've said before in the past, it's a form of resistance towards this idea that in the United States solo se puede escribir en inglés, but on the other hand, it's also a way of acknowledging the long history of Spanish in my life as a writer and as a member of a Mexicano family, as well as all of the readings that have influenced me in my life, right? Both in English and a lot in Spanish. So I think it's very important that we continue, despite the difficulty, that we continue to push on this, so that hopefully, right, the answer to the question of publishing doesn't become, well, just write in English, right? Which is part of, I think, what you were getting at, Nacho, when you talk about the case of two fantastic writers like Cristina and Valeria, right, who are also good friends. But yes, it's true, right? The minute that they switch languages to start publishing, all of a sudden, right, their sort of cultural capital goes up, right? And so I want to believe that we can get to a point where that's no longer the case, right? What you choose to write in a language that you feel is important. As a writer, I always say you write in a language that is that the story tells you to write in. Right. And so, again, this is sort of like my plug for, this is why I write in Spanglish. Right. And I'm a huge advocate for este tipo de mesheo de idioma. Right. I mean, so I speak of code meshing as opposed to code mixing or code switching. See, so it's a code mesh. Y eso es importante, right? Because the reality is that we have, we do have a community that may, if it's not entirely bilingual, it is at least fluent enough or fluid enough to understand and be able to follow in the flow.
There's another issue that the question from YouTube raises that is important to point out, which is that diasporic writers get ignored and discriminated in the countries of origin. Mm-hmm. Growing up in Mexico, I never read Mexican-American Chicano literature. It doesn't get published. The translation of Borderlands, La Frontera of Ansaldo just came out, which is preposterous, right?
Sí.
And there is a very obnoxious perception that comes out even from the mid-century, from Octavio Paz's reading of El Pachuco and so on, that reads Mexican-American literature as not really Mexican,
claro.
People who left. And I have this thing because I edited a history of Mexican literature for Cambridge, and it has a chapter on Mexican-American literature. Shamefully, it's from 2016, and it is the first one to have such a chapter. Mm-hmm. And a reviewer in Mexico, who's a very well-known critic, I won't name him here because he doesn't deserve the traffic. But he in a review that was negative for various reasons. One of the things that he said, and a lot of it was objecting the fact that we were talking about gender and questions like that, but a very conservative critic. But he said he didn't understand why we would have a chapter of Chicano and Mexican American literature when it was, and I quote, the worst of Mexico and the worst of the U.S. combined, right? Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of these perceptions that have plagued the Mexican reading of Mexican American culture until maybe even today. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, Naida, you were speaking about how you didn't really have connections with the literary field back in Venezuela, right? Of course, the diasporas of Cuba and Venezuela have all this political divide also, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it is until very recently that there was an anthology of Peruvians in the U.S. Mm-hmm. That wasn't really the case that they were read in Peru before. So I think that part of the problem is that many literary fields across Latin America neglect the work of the diasporas in the U.S. and they foreclose for no reason the possibility of those writers to be read back in their countries of origin or in their countries of heritage.
Claro.
Amrita, I know you. Well, Naida, go ahead.
Just wanted to add something before I forget, because that's very interesting, Ignacio, what you're saying, especially in the case of Venezuela. I would say that it may be the case in other countries in which the literary world is very closed, right? Close to those who went to college to study letras and got a degree in creative writing, and then who had published in specific publishing houses, in specific cities in Venezuela, for talking about Venezuela, right? And then with the diaspora, because of the economical and political crisis, then it has, as a result, not only writers have left the country, but also editors and publishing houses have left the country, and now they are doing business in Mexico and Spain and other countries. And then that's how Venezuelan literature is going out. So it's very interesting that you say that, because I just published this year. I just published my first text in an anthology of Venezuelan writers, but it's called Escribir Afuera. It's a wonderful anthology. It's beautiful, but it is now that I would say 75 or 80% of the writers have left the country, and actually that the publishing house has established a house out of the country, is that dialogue is being established. And there is an event coming up next week. As Amrita said, there are so many events. In Miami with Eli Bravo, Luis Alejandro Ordóñez, and Camilo Pino, 3 Venezuelan writers who will talk about the Venezuelan literature now that this diaspora is being recognized. So it's a neglection, as Ignacio said, and how this is changing because of we are all out, right?
Sorry, Santiago, just before I forget, a couple of things I wanted to mention. As for Tanya's questions, as far as distribution in Latin America, it is slow, but I know, for example, Capacana has been able to get their books out in Mexico, and I can't remember where it's available. And this morning, I think on Facebook, I saw La Pereza. They have some of their books in Uruguay. So of course, I mean, you've got to follow Facebook or social media to kind of see what's happening. It is slow, but it is happening. And of course, it'll take time. And talking about hierarchies, I mean, it's not just that in Latin America, they don't want to read authors who are writing from the United States. Even in the United States, there is this hierarchy that exists about people who are writing in Spanish from the U.S. Within Spanish departments, for the longest time, there was this hierarchy that Spanish from Spain was what you needed to teach and not the dialects of Latin America, which of course has changed now. But there's again this, I mean, I have heard things, you're going to teach texts written by Latino authors, but they really don't write proper Spanish, So like, you really roll your eyes and just leave it there because you don't want to get into arguments over this. I mean, who has authority about what is pure Spanish or better Spanish and things like that. So of course, I mean, it again goes back to a lot of things. I mean, there are a lot of players that are involved who have to act. Of course, publishers and presses are doing their job, and these ferias are doing their job, and it becomes our job as academics to make sure that they are being read in the classroom, and then we are talking about them, we are writing about them, and not just kind of creating and trying to create these dialogues. And so there's just not this silo. I mean, I'm happy. For example, there was recently a conversation between Ana Castillo and Carolina Herrera. And so, of course, Ana Castillo, this famous Chicano author, she has written in Spanish, but of course we know her more through her English writings. And then Carolina Herrera, who writes in Spanish in the United States. It's like having this conversation is important.
Right.
And so, of course, this will take time. And of course, Santiago, as I think I've already mentioned, he is this, unique creature that we have who, among his contemporary writers, chooses to write in Spanish. And so, I mean, he becomes a bridge between these two spaces as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add something else? Just one thing. Also that the effort that the publishing houses are doing and the magazines, they are, establishing that bridge between the United States and Latin America. For example, Revista Literal with Rosemary Saloon, Urbano, El BieSMan, bringing writers from the United States, but out of the United States, and, trying to establish that. And of course, the print on demand process can take the books into other countries, right? That's small, but it's there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to the question of universities, because my own department has a position open now, as is the case. But it has been very difficult over time to convince administrations for some Spanish departments to host scholars of Latinx literature in Spanish, in part because it is believed that it really belongs in the English department, right? And I have to say that it is very challenging to even just to identify scholars like yourselves, because the scholars of Latinx literature that work on the Hispanophone production is the minority of those scholars. Most of the Latinx studies field really is oriented towards Anglophone production, right? And even there are phenomena that is not the space here, but there is a whole world of Portuguese in Massachusetts. You are very close to that, Naida. And sort of how do Lusophone speakers belong into this question? Maybe, and now we have diasporas who speak Maya, Zapotec, right? Many of them are beginning to participate in literary fields and worlds, and we don't know how to account for the linguistic diversity of Latinx cultures, which is no longer just about Spanish and English, right? So, so that might be a conversation in a festival like this in 5 to 10 years. So when I think we're getting close to the wrapping time, so I'm gonna do a quick round. So I'm gonna go with Santiago, Naida, and Amrita in that order to close the discussion. So Santiago, go ahead.
Híjole, we're almost out of time. So you brought up a lot of really interesting questions, Nacho. So thank you for moderating this. I just wanted to sort of like bring on really quick a couple of things. One is that Mexico did publish Chicanos back in the 70s, right? Era, for example, used to publish a couple of Chicano authors, as well as Joaquin Mortiz. But it's true, it got lost. Right, and that's why it's important to remember. It's important to sort of recover those connections. Two, right, the issues of universities are super important for what we do in the universities to sort of help create or build up this readership and build up this activity. And I think too that the presence of figures like Valeria or like Cristina Rivera are also important, because they also sort of help in some ways generate interest in in this work. And so as a way of breaking down those forms of resistance. And I think that this is why those resistance to other languages within the United States, because there's lots of stuff going on. And I know that we're like almost out. So thank you so much for this. And I'm super happy that I got to converse with Naida and Amrita. And Nacho, I can't wait to see you next week.
Naida, last words?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ignacio, and the festival for inviting me and for organizing this, and El BieSMan for the support, and for the universities. When I was applying for jobs, it was very rare to find a assistant professor of Latinx studies in a department of world languages or Spanish, right? I got my job, the Latinx was like a very small phrase at the bottom of the ad. And actually I am the professor in charge of all Latinx culture and language and literature courses in my department. Now I always see los anuncios. Yeah, I always do. But now I see a little bit more ads of jobs in the departments of languages looking for professors of Latinx studies. So I see that there is a shift, right? It's small, but we're seeing a difference. So.
Okay, and Amrita?
Well, thank you, Ignacio, and again, thank you, Festival and Franky. Again, I would just like to say, I want Santiago and Naida to continue to write in Spanish, and people who are listening out there, if you can read, if you study Spanish, please pick up one of these books and write about them, because it's important that we create a buzz about them. It's not just the job of the writer or the publishing company to be promoting them. It is our job to create readership, create a dialogue. And yes, and I see there's a question about that. There is resistance, but there are folks who are trying to break down the resistance. So we have to kind of join in what we're calling the movement. So we become part of the movement. So now that I say, like, next conference, you're going to pick up a Spanish text and write about that. Thank you.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the participants. A big thank you to Franky Piña, founder of El BieSMan and countless other programs that support and promote the Latinx community and Spanish language authors. Thank you to the National Endowment of the Arts, Illinois Humanities, Artworks Fund, Vocalo, and to our many generous partners, grant makers, and donors who make the festival possible. Please visit our website, litluz.org, to learn about the upcoming programs. And for those of you in Chicago, we hope to see you today later in the Instituto Cervantes.
Perfecto.